Do you remember the forgotten foods poor men used to stockpile in their pantry? Back then, a few jars of beans, flour, and salt could mean the difference between going hungry and getting by. What did they know about getting through hard times that we've stopped remembering? Salt pork and lard were the beating heart of every poor man's pantry. When you think of survival food, you probably imagine beans or bread, but it was actually fat that kept most families alive through harsh winters. Salt pork was the flavor base, the miracle worker, and the cheapest source of calories anyone could get their hands on. It was heavily salted so it would not spoil and could last for months in a cool pantry, making it a godsend when refrigeration was a luxury. People would slice it thin and use just a little piece to fry potatoes, season beans, or grease a skillet before making cornbread. Every drop of lard saved from Sunday dinners went into a tin bucket because nothing was wasted. You could bake with it, fry with it, even spread it on toast if times were really desperate. The smell of lard sizzling on an iron pan became a kind of comfort, the sound of someone trying their best. Kids would joke about fat bread breakfasts, but they ate it happily. There was a quiet pride in making something out of scraps, in keeping bellies full without going hungry. Those buckets of lard were as valuable as gold to a household, standing for patience, frugality, and the sort of cleverness that came from doing more with less. You might not see lard buckets in a modern kitchen anymore, but back then, they meant survival, pure and simple. Dried pinto beans were the real muscle behind every hard-time meal. They were humble, sure, but they were also one of the most important foods ever stocked in American pantries. Poor men relied on them because they were cheap, filling, and versatile enough to become anything, from stews to soups to spreads. You could buy a big sack of dried beans for a few cents, soak them overnight, and stretch one pot into several days' worth of dinners. When meat disappeared from the table, beans stepped up. Mothers would season them with salt pork or just a spoonful of lard, maybe toss in an onion if they had one. The result was hearty and comforting, proof that flavor could be coaxed out of almost nothing. Beans didn't just feed stomachs, they fed communities. Churches, farms, and neighbors shared sacks during bad winters, knowing that beans meant everyone would eat. The smell of a bean pot simmering on the stove was a signal of warmth, of life continuing even when money was tight. They were the kind of food that asked for patience but gave back comfort in return, a true testament to the art of surviving with grace. Cornmeal was the magic dust of poor households, cheap, shelf-stable, and endlessly useful. A single sack could turn into mush for breakfast, hoe cakes for lunch, and cornbread for dinner. Farmers used it, miners used it, families swore by it. Cornmeal was filling, nutritious, and worked with just about any leftover you had lying around. It was the one ingredient that could carry you through a whole week of hunger without complaint. People used it with lard drippings to make golden cakes crisp on the edges and soft in the middle. For others, it meant a pot of warm corn mush, sweetened with molasses or salted for a savory twist. Kids grew up on it, and mothers stretched it with water when milk was gone. When the pantry looked bare, cornmeal never disappointed. It was the friend that always stayed. Its grainy texture and rich smell of roasting corn were the scent of home for millions. Even today, there's something grounding about a skillet of cornbread, reminding us how far thrift and a bit of grit could take a person. Flour barrels were the throne of every kitchen, the one thing no home could function without. A big barrel of flour in the corner meant security. It meant bread, dumplings, biscuits, and gravies for days. Poor men guarded their flour like treasure because one scoop could mean breakfast for the family. When you opened the lid and saw a fine white cloud rise, it felt like hope itself. Housewives made biscuits on wooden boards, cutting circles with cups when they had no proper tools. Dumplings floated in broth like little clouds, thickening soups that could stretch another night. Flour was also the base for gravy, that golden miracle that turned scraps into feasts. The smell of hot flour and fat cooking together was as close as you got to luxury on a poor man's plate. It was simple, practical, and pure, proof that even the most basic things can hold a kind of sacred power when times are hard. The barrel stood as a silent promise that tomorrow's meal was already halfway there. Evaporated and powdered milk were the quiet heroes of the poor man's pantry, the kind that didn't look like much but made all the difference. When fresh milk was too expensive or too far to fetch, these tins stepped in. Powdered milk mixed with water could be used for baking, breakfast, and even feeding babies when nothing else was around. Evaporated milk had that thick, sweet flavor that made coffee richer and pies creamier. It was comfort in a can. People learned to trust it because it never spoiled and could sit on a shelf for months. During lean winters, that security meant everything. You'd see families mix a little milk powder with oats, stretch it into gravy, or stir it into mashed potatoes. It might not have been the farm fresh kind, but it carried the same warmth. For many, those tins meant nourishment and dignity in a time when both were scarce. Molasses jugs were the sweetness in a bitter life. Cheap and long-lasting, molasses could turn the plainest meal into something special. You could drizzle it on cornbread, stir it into beans, or mix it with hot water for a makeshift tea. It had a deep, smoky sweetness that tasted like comfort itself. Poor families loved it because it was cheaper than sugar and lasted 10 times longer. A single jug could see a household through months of tight times. Kids dipped biscuits in it, farmers used it to sweeten their coffee, and mothers poured it into cakes when they wanted to feel fancy. That thick, dark syrup was more than food. It was memory in liquid form. When money was thin and cupboards nearly bare, molasses was the one indulgence you could still afford. It reminded people that joy could still exist in small, sticky spoonfuls. Dried saltfish was a poor man's meat, cheap, salty, and ready to last through any storm. Before refrigeration, this was how families near the coasts stayed fed all winter. Fishermen would pack the catch in layers of salt until the flesh turned firm and dry, locking in the flavor. Once you had it, all you needed was water and patience to bring it back to life. Rehydrated, fried, or stewed, it carried the taste of the sea and the grit of survival. Poor households found ways to stretch even a small piece into a full pot of chowder or beans. The smell might have been strong, but so was the satisfaction. Salt fish connected entire communities, from the docks of New England to the rural South, where people learned to turn scarcity into tradition. It was proof that with enough salt, skill, and determination, nothing had to go to waste. Canned tomatoes were the red gold of the poor man's pantry. They were cheap to make, easy to store, and could rescue just about any meal. During summer, when gardens overflowed, families canned tomatoes in big batches, lining shelves with jars that glowed like sunset. By winter, those jars became survival itself. Soups, stews, gravies, even casseroles, all started with a jar of tomatoes. Their tangy sweetness made even the plainest food feel alive. A spoonful of tomato could stretch a small bit of meat across a whole family's dinner. It added color, warmth, and flavor to gray days and gray plates. More than anything, canned tomatoes symbolized preparation, doing the hard work now so you could eat later. Every pop of a jar lid was a victory, proof that someone had planned ahead. Oats and rolled grains were the quiet champions of frugality. A tin of oats might not look like much, but it could feed a family for days. Porridge for breakfast, oat bread for supper, or even oats used to thicken a stew, it all came from the same humble tin. They were filling, affordable, and versatile, which made them a staple in every working-class pantry. Kids were sent to school with oat mush in their stomachs, warm and heavy enough to keep hunger away until dinner. Farmers mixed them with whatever sweeteners they had, molasses, syrup, or sugar, to make simple cookies or oat cakes. Oats didn't spoil easily either, which made them perfect for long winters. They were the quiet kind of comfort food, the kind that didn't brag but always delivered. Their scent alone, the smell of something to eat, was enough to keep spirits up. Root-cellar vegetables like turnips, carrots, and beets were the unsung heroes of survival. Pulled from the cold earth, scrubbed clean, and tucked away in dirt or sawdust, these vegetables could last for months. They didn't need fancy storage or refrigeration, just patience and a cool spot. When the snow came down and gardens were bare, The root cellar was where hope lived. Families would pull out a few turnips or beets and boil them into thick soups or mashed dishes. They were the backbone of winter eating, sturdy, dependable, and nourishing. The earthy scent of boiling vegetables filled homes with warmth even when the world outside froze over. Kids might have groaned at another bowl of turnip stew, but their parents knew it meant survival. Those root vegetables were like old friends, never glamorous, but always there when you needed them. Rice was the backbone of the poor man's dinner plate. Simple, cheap, and endlessly adaptable. You could stretch a single sack of rice for weeks, and that was the whole point. Whether it was boiled with milk for breakfast, simmered in gravy for dinner, or paired with beans for a complete meal, rice could make anything feel like a feast. It was one of those ingredients that seemed small, but carried entire families through the toughest times. It absorbed flavor like magic, soaking up lard drippings, salt, or molasses until it turned from plain to perfect. People loved it because it filled you up fast and asked for almost nothing in return. It cooked quick, stayed soft even when reheated, and never went bad if stored right. A single pot of rice was comfort, survival, and satisfaction all rolled into one. No matter how rough life got, a bowl of warm rice always meant you were still standing. Sometimes families mixed in vegetables or broth, turning it into a dish that felt rich even when it wasn't. For poor households, rice wasn't just food. It was a blank canvas for hope, flavor, and endurance. Every spoonful told a story of thrift and creativity, proving that survival could still taste like home. Dried apples or peaches were the candy of the poor. When fruit season ended and the trees went bare, families turned to their stored slices for sweetness. They were carefully strung on twine or dried on tin roofs under the sun until leathery but fragrant, then tucked away in jars for the winter. Come cold months, those shriveled bits were magic, rehydrated in stews, baked into pies, or stirred into oatmeal for breakfast. The smell of simmering dried peaches could fill a house with nostalgia, a memory of better days when fruit was fresh and full. These humble little treasures reminded families that sweetness didn't always come from luxury. It came from effort, from patience, from knowing how to make things last. Kids looked forward to dried fruit desserts like city children waited for candy. They were proof that joy could be saved in a jar, waiting quietly until you needed it most. Housewives knew every slice mattered, saving even bruised fruit to dry so nothing was wasted. That soft sweetness in a pie or porridge reminded everyone that even in the leanest winters, the taste of summer could still find its way home. Homemade vinegar was the secret weapon of every thrifty household. It was cheap to make, lasted forever, and worked for just about everything. From pickling vegetables to cleaning countertops, it was liquid gold to anyone trying to stretch their budget. A jug of vinegar kept food edible longer, added tang to dishes, and even cured meat when refrigeration was not an option. Some families made it from leftover cider or wine, others from apples gone soft, letting it ferment until sharp and strong. It was a survival tool dressed up as a kitchen staple. When money was short, vinegar was the closest thing you had to a miracle fix, keeping your food safe, your pans clean, and your meals flavorful. Its sharp bite wasn't just about taste, it was about tenacity. A pantry without vinegar wasn't a pantry at all. Housewives would use it to pickle everything from cucumbers to eggs, sealing away food for the winter months. Even a small splash could transform bland food into something bright and alive. In a world where almost nothing lasted long, vinegar stood firm, sour, and strong, a tiny testament to resourcefulness and resilience. Coffee substitutes like chicory or roasted barley were what got people through mornings when real coffee was out of reach. Poor men brewed whatever they could find to mimic that comforting bitterness. Chicory root was dug up, roasted dark and ground into powder, while barley or wheat was toasted and boiled until it gave off that roasted smell everyone craved. It wasn't perfect, but it was close enough to keep spirits high. Those makeshift brews filled kitchens with warmth and gave workers the strength to face another long day. You didn't drink it for caffeine. You drank it for comfort, for routine, for that feeling of normal life in uncertain times. Each cup was a quiet rebellion against hardship, proof that even when money ran out, resourcefulness never did. It was a small, daily ritual that gave structure to days that often felt uncertain. The sound of the kettle, the smell of roasted grain, it all reminded families that they still had control over something. Even without real coffee, they still had mornings worth waking up to, moments of warmth and peace in the middle of struggle. Canned corn and hominy were a taste of sunshine when fields froze over. When fresh corn was long gone, these yellow kernels kept spirits up through the darkest months. Cheap, filling, and easy to prepare, they became staples in every poor household. A can of corn could be tossed into soups, mashed into fritters, or fried with salt pork for something hearty. Hominy, with its chewy texture, turned into stews that could feed an entire family from one pot. It was the kind of food that didn't complain. It just showed up, meal after meal, doing its job. Kids loved the sweetness, adults loved the comfort, and everyone loved how far a single can could stretch. In a world where fresh food was fleeting, canned corn and hominy stood for hope in tin form. They were the foods that brought color to gray days, feeding both body and spirit. People learned to appreciate the gentle sweetness, the soft bite, and the way corn could make even a bland dinner taste like something special. For those who had nothing but a few cans on their shelves, opening one felt like opening summer itself. A small burst of warmth, golden and good in the heart of winter. Cured country ham ends were tiny scraps of luxury saved for flavor rather than feasting. Most families could not afford a whole ham, but a leftover bone or small end piece could transform a meal. Tossed into a pot of beans or greens, it would release just enough smoky salt to make everything taste like home. These bits were often saved from holidays or bought cheap from butchers who knew their worth. Nothing went to waste, not the rind, not the fat, not even the bone. That little piece of ham was love and memory simmering on the stove, a reminder that good flavor didn't need abundance. It was about care, timing, and knowing that a touch of meat could make a poor meal taste rich. Families used ham ends to stretch flavor for days, letting the same bone season pot after pot. When you lifted the lid and smelled that savory scent, it felt like abundance, even if it came from scraps. The taste lingered, a smoky whisper of something better, and it kept people hopeful through hard seasons. Hardtack crackers were the original shelf-stable snack, though snack might be too generous a word. They were tough, dry, and built to last for months without spoiling. Made from nothing more than flour, water, and salt, these dense crackers were soldiers' food turned survival food. Poor families baked them in batches, storing them in tins for when there was nothing else. Soaked in soup or milk, they softened just enough to chew, and that was often dinner. Kids called them toothbreakers, but when hunger hit, no one complained. Hardtack was proof that food didn't need to be fancy, it just needed to last. Each bite carried the history of survival itself, plain and proud. Housewives learned to punch holes into the dough so it baked evenly, and they'd stack them neatly in jars or tins to keep the damp out. On long winter nights, people would crumble them into stews or soak them in hot water and sugar to make a makeshift pudding. It was simple, sturdy, and honest, food that did its duty without apology. Canned sardines or oysters were the ocean's gift to the working class. They were cheap, full of protein, and ready to eat straight from the tin. A few sardines mashed on bread with a sprinkle of salt could pass for a fine meal after a hard day's work. Poor men loved them because they were practical. No cooking, no fuss, and no waste. Canned oysters added a touch of decadence to an otherwise bare pantry, often mixed with potatoes or cornmeal to stretch them further. The salty smell filled kitchens with a sense of satisfaction that came from having something hearty, something real. These tins were more than food. They were dignity in a can, giving people the strength to keep going when times were rough. Sardine oil wasn't wasted either. It went back into the pan for frying potatoes or onions. Even kids who wrinkled their noses at the smell grew to love them once hunger took hold. These cans symbolized resilience, the ability to turn something small into something sustaining. Pickled eggs and beets were the jewels of the pantry. bright, beautiful, and built to last. Soaked in vinegar, sugar, and salt, they glowed like treasures in glass jars. The eggs turned pink, the beets softened, and together they made a meal that was cheap, colorful, and full of flavor. They were a common sight at farmhouse tables and taverns alike, where people admired their color as much as their taste. Pickled foods were insurance against hunger, proof that smart hands and simple tools could outsmart any shortage. Every bite carried a tangy reminder that thrift could still be delicious. Families would open a jar and set it proudly on the table as if it were a dish fit for company. The vinegar smell filled the room, sharp but comforting, reminding everyone that preparation meant survival. Even months after harvest, those ruby-red jars stood gleaming, a symbol of effort preserved and beauty made edible. Homemade jelly or preserves were pure happiness in a jar. When sugar was rationed and fruit was scarce, families saved what little they could, wild berries, apples, even crab apples, to boil down into spreads. It was one of the few luxuries that even the poorest households tried to keep around. A spoonful on a biscuit or cornbread could make a hard morning feel a little softer. These preserves weren't just about sweetness. They were about memory, about holding on to the taste of summer through the long, cold months. Every jar represented hours of patience and love, sealed tight for when the world felt a little too empty. The process itself was almost sacred, stirring the pot slowly, testing for the right thickness, then sealing it with care. When winter hit and snow piled high, opening that jar felt like visiting a sunny afternoon again. The sweet smell of fruit filled the air, a reminder that even in the leanest times, a little sweetness could still be found. Dried peas and lentils were the quiet backbone of poor men's kitchens. Long before protein powders and instant meals, these humble legumes held families together. Cheap to buy, easy to store, and nourishing beyond measure, they became the base of countless soups and stews. All you needed was a pot, some water, and time. The longer they simmered, the richer they got, turning into thick, comforting poor man's stew that could feed a crowd with pennies. The beauty of dried peas and lentils was their patience. They waited quietly in sacks for the moment they were needed most. Families often paired them with scraps of vegetables or a bone for flavor, sometimes tossing in a spoonful of drippings for richness. Their earthy, simple taste became the flavor of resilience itself. No one went hungry with a pot of lentil soup on the stove. In times when the pantry echoed empty, these small, round blessings were the difference between despair and dinner. Baking soda and powder were the invisible miracle workers in the pantry. They didn't look like much, just white dust in little tins, but they gave rise to everything from biscuits to cakes to cornbread. When yeast was too expensive or hard to find, these powders became the heart of daily bread making. A pinch of soda in buttermilk made biscuits puff up like clouds. Baking powder turned a bowl of flour and lard into something golden and light. Housewives guarded their tins carefully, measuring out each spoonful with practiced precision. Without them, the kitchen fell flat, literally. They were the silent partners in every oven miracle, transforming humble ingredients into treats that felt rich even when wallets were thin. Each whiff of freshly baked bread or biscuits carried the scent of hope rising again. Canned pumpkin was autumn preserved in tin. When harvests ended and fields went bare, these cans kept a little piece of fall alive. Housewives could whip up pies, casseroles, or even soups that tasted like celebration, no matter the season. Poor families loved it because it stretched far. A single can could feed a family twice over. Its natural sweetness meant you didn't need much sugar, and it paired beautifully with cinnamon or molasses for warmth. During lean winters, canned pumpkin was both dessert and dinner, rich in nutrients and comfort. The smell of pumpkin baking in an old oven filled homes with a rare kind of joy, one that felt almost festive. It was proof that even the poorest table could still hold a little beauty. In many homes, canned pumpkin became part of Sunday meals, reminding families of better days and harvest blessings. Even when money was scarce, mothers made sure a pie or pudding found its way to the table during holidays. The creamy orange filling symbolized abundance, memory, and gratitude all at once. You didn't need a fancy meal to feel rich. Just the familiar taste of spiced pumpkin, baked slow and served warm to those you loved most. Tallow and dripping jars were the unsung savings accounts of the kitchen. Every drop of fat that dripped off roasting meat was poured into jars, cooled and saved for later. Nothing was wasted, not even the grease. Housewives used it for frying potatoes, baking biscuits, greasing pans, or even making candles. The jars lined up on pantry shelves were like badges of resourcefulness, gleaming pale gold in the light. The smell of tallow heating on a stove was a sign that a meal was on its way. It stretched flavor further, fed families longer, and proved that ingenuity could turn scraps into treasure. Those jars weren't just full of fat. They were full of pride, of lessons passed from one frugal generation to the next. Children learned early to save every drop, scraping pans carefully so nothing went to waste. Some families even rubbed tallow on boots to keep out rain or polished wood with it when cleaner was too costly. It was more than food storage. It was survival, thrift, and wisdom layered together, glistening under a soft light that smelled faintly of home. Homemade sauerkraut brought life to the winter table when freshness was just a memory. Cabbage, salt, and patience. That was all it took. Families packed shredded cabbage into crocks, pressed it down, and let time work its magic. Weeks later, they had tangy, vitamin-rich sauerkraut that kept scurvy and gloom at bay. It was both food and medicine, and it broke up the monotony of dried grains and beans. The sour smell of fermenting kraut filled basements, a scent that meant someone in the house was thinking ahead. Poor men and women relied on it to add brightness to dull meals. It wasn't fancy, but it kept people healthy, and that made it priceless. When jars were opened, the pop of the lid meant nourishment was on its way. Families mixed it with sausages, potatoes, or beans to make a meal that was simple yet satisfying. Its tangy flavor cut through the heaviness of salted meats, bringing balance to the plate. Even in the darkest winters, sauerkraut was a sign of life continuing, proof that with care and patience, the earth could still provide. Cracked wheat or bulgur was a quiet miracle for Depression-era cooks. It was cheap, hearty, and could turn into breakfast, lunch, or dinner with almost no effort. Boiled with butter, it made a filling porridge. Mixed into bread dough, it gave loaves a nutty chew. For supper, it could be paired with vegetables or broth to make something that stuck to your ribs. It was the food of hard times, but also of endurance. You could taste the earthiness of the field and the work it took to bring it to the table. Families leaned on cracked wheat when flour ran out, grateful for its strength and simplicity. It was proof that good food didn't need riches, just a little heat, a little water, and a lot of heart. Some people sweetened it with molasses or syrup for dessert, while others served it plain with a bit of salt and milk. It filled bellies and gave strength to workers who needed energy to last the day. In a world of uncertainty, cracked wheat was certainty itself, humble, dependable, and quietly nourishing. Dried soup mixes and bouillon cubes were the pantry's magicians, turning water into warmth. A single cube could transform a pot of plain vegetables into something hearty. During the Great Depression and World War years, they became lifelines, cheap, compact, and flavorful. They saved time, stretched meals, and comforted tired families. The smell of broth simmering on the stove was enough to lift spirits after long, cold days. Housewives crushed bouillon cubes into gravies, added them to beans, or used them as quick seasoning when nothing else was left. Those little cubes carried big comfort, proof that good flavor could come from the smallest things. The crinkle of the wrapper alone could spark excitement in the kitchen, because it meant dinner would taste like something more than water and salt. Even a single cube could make leftovers feel like a feast. It was the working man's secret luxury, a tiny miracle that turned meager meals into moments of peace. Canned evaporated soup bases were a godsend for large families with little time and even less money. Thick, rich, and concentrated, they could be diluted to make pots of soup that filled every belly. The cans stacked neatly on shelves, waiting for days when fresh produce or meat were out of reach. Mothers used them as shortcuts for gravies or casseroles, blending them with leftover rice or noodles to make something hearty. The smell of creamy soup simmering on the stove filled the air with warmth and gratitude. They were modern miracles in the making, proof that canned goods could bring dignity to the dinner table even in the hardest times. For working families, these soups were the difference between hunger and hope. A single can could stretch to feed 6, and every spoonful tasted like relief. They were simple, yes, but they brought consistency, a small luxury in unpredictable days. Homemade syrup was thrift turned sweet. When maple syrup or honey were luxuries, poor families mixed sugar water with vanilla, molasses, or even fruit peel for flavor. It poured over pancakes, stirred into coffee, and sweetened oatmeal for hungry children. Every household had its own secret twist. Some added lemon zest, others a pinch of cinnamon. The syrup shimmered like liquid amber, a simple pleasure made from near nothing. It reminded families that sweetness didn't have to come from wealth. It could come from creativity, from learning to make do and still make it beautiful. Mothers made it in old saucepans, stirring slowly and tasting as it thickened, making sure it didn't burn. Kids would hover nearby, spoons in hand, waiting for the first pour. It became a small ritual in the home, a shared joy built out of scarcity. Corn syrup and baking molasses mix was the Depression cook's greatest trick. Sugar was expensive and rationed, but this homemade blend could stretch it for months. Families mixed corn syrup with dark molasses to create a rich, smoky sweetener perfect for pies, cakes, and breads. It added depth and flavor that sugar alone could not match. Every drop was treasured, poured carefully to the last. Housewives kept jars of it on their shelves like gold. It was a symbol of resilience, proof that when life got bitter, you could always find a way to make it sweet again. The smell of molasses bubbling on the stove brought memories of holidays, of warmth, of moments when families gathered despite the hardships. Even when times were lean, that rich brown sweetness gave meals a sense of celebration. It wasn't just a recipe, it was a survival story written in syrup. Rock-hard ribbon candy sat untouched in Grandma's dish for years. Its layers solidified into a fortress of sugar. Sweet, sticky, and unyielding, this candy was a symbol of how much longer things used to last. People back then didn't just eat candy. They stored it, they savored it, they knew how to make it stretch. In a world where food was often rationed, every morsel mattered. The ribbon candy was made by hand, folded in intricate patterns, and stored away for holidays or special occasions. But its real value came from its resilience, not just to the weather, but to time itself. It could sit for decades on a shelf, turning rock-hard and sticky with age. And even then, it still had a taste that took you back to simpler days. It was a candy of endurance, a confection that somehow, through sheer force of will, survived everything: wars, rationing, and the inevitable passage of time. If you were lucky, Grandma would offer you a piece when you visited, and even if it was as hard as a rock, it was a taste of something from another era. Sorghum syrup had 3 great uses during the war that the United States had actively participated in. It was something the government could rely on both for the people of America and the country's soldiers. So it became a key player just off of that alone. Secondly, most areas already had a knack for sorghum, and it was the more affordable option for a lot of different regions. This was thanks to most places producing their own sorghum, and that's why the disruption in the global supply chain hadn't really affected sorghum production too badly. That's a factor that lots of people don't talk about enough, but supplies for the entire world had become low everywhere by this point. Sorghum was a great alternative to sugar, molasses, and malts, and it helped to keep some of this in store as well. Sorghum also had a bit of magnesium, but it was a really good source of iron. It was also a wonderful sweetener, and this was actually a part of an overall bigger movement. For the first time in a while, the mainstream masses were delving into the culture that was out there in America. Sorghum syrup was a niche part of American syrups, for example, but in folk traditions, it's always been wildly popular. The war was just the first time the general public explored those traditions. During the Great Depression, corn syrup wasn't just a sweetener, it was liquid gold. It was cheap, endlessly versatile, a pantry staple that helped stretch sugar supplies and satisfy sweet cravings when dessert options were slim. Corn syrup was a baking ingredient, but it was also a problem-solving ingredient. It sweetened oatmeal, preserved fruits, replaced expensive honey or maple syrup, and even found its way into homemade candies and frostings. Corn syrup was the next best thing for families with a sweet tooth but no budget to indulge. One of its hidden talents? It also acts as a secret weapon in making food last longer. Jams and jellies were often made with corn syrup to keep them fresh for months. It also ended up in Depression-era classics like pecan pie or molasses cookies, where it gave simple ingredients a rich, gooey texture that made them seem decadent. Modern critics might snicker at corn syrup's nutritional downsides, but during the Depression, no one cared. It was cheap, it was plentiful, and it kept families fed. It was a small but meaningful taste of happiness for kids lucky enough to get a corn syrup-laced treat. Canned luncheon meat was like Spam's less famous but more generic cousin during the post-war days. It was another affordable protein source that was readily available everywhere. It was used in sandwiches, salads, or simply eaten on its own when no other resource was around. It was also a good choice for big households when wallets were too tight back in the day. It was an instant hit in the States and made its way to other parts of the world before it became a pantry staple in Europe too. I mean, what's not to love about a cheap, easy-to-make meat option that's easy to store and prepare? But let's be honest, it's probably best left in the can. Unless you're a fan of processed meat flavor, I know I'm not. Fruitcakes soaked in brandy or rum were once the crown jewels of holiday tables. Dense, rich, and packed with so much alcohol they could outlive the people who made them. These cakes were not baked for freshness. They were made to last, wrapped tightly in cloth and stashed in tin boxes, sometimes forgotten for years until rediscovered like edible treasure chests. Grandmothers knew the secret. Fruitcakes got better with time, their flavors deepening as the brandy seeped in and preserved everything inside. Every slice tasted like memory, of snowy Decembers, of distant voices in candlelit kitchens, of laughter held tight in an airtight world. It was more than dessert. It was tradition, defiance, and preservation in a world that changed too fast. And somewhere, there is still a cake waiting, older than most of us, still moist, still potent, and still whispering stories through its syrupy crumb. Powdered malt, on the other hand, was something that also gave people another shot at making the things they used for comfort. People used powdered malt in baking and for making drinks at home, which was a pretty treasured source of that energy I was just talking about. You should never underestimate the importance of a good drink, especially because it's so good at lifting your mood up. Powdered malt also worked as a fantastic substitute for sugar, since that was pretty much rationed heavily throughout the war. Bakers either went out of business if they couldn't access it, or they relied entirely on powdered malt to keep themselves going. After all, what's a dessert without a sweetener? Malt extracts had things like glucose and maltose, which were pretty much the entire point of sugar to begin with. They were also helpful in keeping the ingredients you did have last longer. If you were starting to run just a bit low on your supply of molasses, then you would go for powdered malt, which was also easily available. The Great Depression was no reason to skip gelatin packets, which were pantry staples and culinary alchemy in powdered form. Gelatin was a cook's best friend because of its uncanny ability to turn liquid into solid, allowing it to stretch ingredients farther than anyone thought possible. Why was gelatin so popular during the Depression? First of all, it was cheap and easy to store. The packets could sit on the shelf indefinitely, waiting for the day when a family had to pull something out of the cupboard, something that looked like a real meal. Gelatin was even used to make mock recipes that looked like expensive foods, so families could enjoy a taste of luxury on a shoestring budget. In the 1930s, gelatin was a sign of ingenuity and resourcefulness, but today it conjures up images of wobbly Jell-O molds at family gatherings. Its culinary heyday may be over, but gelatin is a nostalgic reminder of how far creativity can go when times are hard. If you're a fan of pineapple on pizza, you would have loved this next one. Pineapple and cheese salad was a unique delight back in the day. This dish came into existence when someone decided to mix pineapple and cheese together in times of misery. Imagine cubes of pineapple in a creamy cheese mixture, terrifying or finger-licking delicious? There's no in-between. This was a variation of the infamous candle salad, which was a vintage fruit salad popular in America in the 1920s and was typically composed of lettuce, pineapple, banana, cherry, and either mayonnaise or cottage cheese. This was considered a luxurious delicacy during the tough times of the war, but just fails to meet the standards now. It's still a great way to use up leftover pineapple from your holiday punch if you're ever feeling adventurous. Canned brown bread sounds like a punchline until you have lived through winters with no oven and no power. In New England, it was not a joke. It was dessert, dinner, and backup food in a single can. Baked right inside the metal, the bread would slide out in a dark, dense cylinder, moist, sweet, and somehow still good. It is made with molasses, whole grains, and a stubborn kind of magic that refuses to spoil. Families passed down cans like heirlooms. You sliced it cold or steamed it in a pot, served with beans or just plain butter. And no, it did not look like the soft sandwich bread we are used to. It looked like something you would find on an old ship or in a miner's lunch pail. Because that is exactly where it came from. The bread did not need a fridge. Still edible. Still standing. In a world obsessed with freshness, this stubborn little can of bread was a quiet rebellion. It was the food equivalent of a handwritten letter, slower, denser, more real. So we've gone over the greens people eat during times like this, as well as what they substitute in the place of regular food they no longer had access to. What about the most important part of American eating? Well, naturally, you can't have a United States without protein. Canned minced meat was the general solution everybody came up with in the face of the food shortage that everybody was facing. Protein simply became a non-factor in most people's day because the best, really good, and even slightly above average cuts of meat were always rationed away by the government for the use of soldiers. That left people to start eating things like necks, feet, tongues, and other parts of animals they hadn't ever used. Things like offal eating really became popular, and one thing that really helped alleviate the shortage was canned minced meat. Canned minced meat wasn't usually pre-seasoned, though some variants did come with a lot of generous seasoning, which made it easier to keep down too. However, they were also just a bit more expensive, and people were trying their best to keep costs down on the low. Plus, loads of people had already kept a store of basic seasonings and herbs to use for situations like this. Being cost-effective was a routine for the American public by that point. Canned liver wasn't the most comfortable food, but it was a lifeline during the Great Depression. This pantry staple was a nutritional powerhouse, packed with protein, vitamins, and minerals, and didn't require refrigeration, a godsend for families without access to fresh meat. It was metallic and mushy, but on a day when every calorie mattered, canned liver did the trick. The canned liver was a surprisingly versatile food. It could be spread on bread for a quick meal, mixed into casseroles, or fried up with onions to make something almost palatable. Its rich flavor, sometimes too rich, made it a cheap way to feed a family because a little went a long way. Canned liver can even be blended into meatloaf or meatballs, stretching meals without sacrificing protein for those willing to get creative. Canned liver is a rare thing today, but its legacy lives on as a symbol of frugality and resilience. It wasn't about taste or presentation for Depression-era families, it was about survival. A tin of canned liver in the cupboard was evidence that even the most unappealing ingredients could keep you alive and give you hope when things got the toughest. Canned ham was like the instant ramen of foods back in the post-war days. In 1940, it started gaining traction as the miracle meat during World War II. It was also transported as an aid to Great Britain and the Soviet Union. Canned ham was nothing fancy, which was the best thing about this meal. It was perfect for busy households or people on the run. Plus, its long shelf life was like the cherry on top. Back in the day, this was a convenience food dream come true. No fuss, no muss, just a whole lot of ham. But let's be real. Fresh ham is where it's at. Unless you're stranded on a desert island, I'd stick to the deli counter. We don't need to punish ourselves with canned meat anymore, which is why this dinner has become a part of ancient history. Dehydrated potato flakes were the powdered miracle nobody saw coming. They arrived in wartime boxes with faded labels and strict instructions, as if instant food required discipline. And maybe it did. These flakes were not just for convenience. They were military issue, battlefield fuel, and ration card gold. You would pour in hot water, stir, and just like that, mashed potatoes without a farm in sight. Families clung to them when real potatoes were either too expensive or completely unavailable. Grandmothers made them taste like Sunday dinner with a little butter and salt, while children scarfed them down because they were warm and filling. Even after the war, those boxes never really went away. They slid into pantries and onto shelves, waiting silently for the next crisis. And in homes that remembered leaner years, those flakes became tradition. Rehydrated, they puffed up like a memory. Flat to full, empty enough. And they are still made the same way today. Canned applesauce powder was something that hadn't really taken solid form as a concept until the war. There was a lot of use for drying fruits and vegetables as a way to help extend the shelf life of people. It was really hard for people to get vitamin C, and applesauce itself was a really good pureed form of apples that was helpful in providing exactly those kinds of vitamins that people lacked. The inherent sugar that apples had was also something that really helped the population during this time. Dehydrated applesauce was common, but to make it in the form of powder wasn't something that people had experimented with. The technique for this came about thanks to the war efforts, and it was entirely a gamble to make applesauce more transportable. Can you imagine the government delegating real-time resources and efforts to making applesauce easier to carry? It actually does things like that very often. The aim was to make something that both civilians and soldiers could benefit from, and I think they nailed it. There's no better way of repurposing leftover mashed potatoes than making potato cakes. It's a name given to various shaped potato dishes around the world, including a patty of hashed potatoes, a fried patty of mashed potato, a fried and battered slice of potato, or a flatbread made with mashed potato and flour. These fried patties were crispy on the outside and soft on the inside, often served as a side dish or breakfast item. In northern England and some states in Australia, a thin slice of potato that was battered and deep fried was called a potato scallop. In Australia and New Zealand, the terms potato cake, potato flip, and potato fritter were used instead. They were often flavored with onions, herbs, or cheese and served with a dollop of sour cream, or alongside other breakfast items like eggs and bacon. With the rise of hash browns, potato cakes are barely missed today, but if you ever feel like cooking something comforting, I say give this one a try. Hardtack did not pretend to be soft. These crackers were survival baked into bricks. Soldiers bit them, sailors soaked them, and grandparents stored them. World War II may have ended, but the leftover rations stayed, stacked in basements and bunkers long after the siren stopped. Not for days, not for weeks, but for decades. Your grandparents knew that if things ever got that bad again, they had backup. Some folks today have found boxes unopened since the 1940s, and guess what? Still edible. That is not food, that is foresight. Sure, you might need a hammer or a hot bowl of broth to soften it up, but the fact that it still exists tells you something. Our ancestors did not trust the future, they trusted preparation. One hardtack cracker could outlive a marriage, a war, even an entire government. And it did. This was not about taste, it was about security. Biting into one was like biting into the past. Dry, tough, but dependable. The kind of food you hope you never need, but keep anyway, just in case. Powdered cheese mixes, on the other hand, were a different kind of relief for the masses. While basic everyday ingredients like vegetable cubes and dried noodles restored that nostalgia of eating a good hearty dinner when people came back home from work, they weren't exactly the kind of flavors people associated with being laid up in bed, all comfortable eating your favorite little snack. Cheese was always involved in most of the comfort food that ever got popular in America, but dairy and cheese in general became extremely hard for most people to even dare to think about getting. How could you afford to spend money on things like cheese when people have been eating lentils the next day and not even a big generous helping of them, like just scraps? That's the way most people were living. If you think I might be exaggerating it, then you have to understand, America had been put through the ringer a bit before the Second World War as well. The effects of the first still hadn't fully resolved. Brands like Kraft really made their name during this time too, because it was their macaroni and cheese mix, which first came out in 1937, that really made waves for people during this time. In the Depression era, parsnips were Depression-era gold. They sweetened hard times with their distinct, not very exciting flavor. Parsnips were unlike finicky crops. They didn't mind poor soil or cold weather. In fact, a frost made them taste better. These pale cousins of the carrot were loved for their versatility and their ability to stick around all winter, making them a must-stock for any frugal household. If you had parsnips in the pantry, you were in for something delicious, or at least filling. Parsnips were boiled, roasted, or mashed, and were a blank canvas for creative cooks. They gave soups and stews a hint of sweetness, and could even be used in place of potatoes as a pinch. In fact, they were so reliable a crop that they often ended up in desserts, contributing their natural sugars to cakes, custards, and puddings. They weren't just tasty. They were nutritious and full of fiber, vitamins, and potassium. Parsnips have been trendy root vegetables for modern foodies, but in the 1930s, they were a staple that kept families from hunger. Hogshead cheese is one of the more bizarre meals on the list. Okay, before you jump to any conclusions judging from the name, this meaty meal doesn't contain any cheese or any dairy products at all. This unique delicacy originated somewhere in ancient Germany and instantly made its way to other parts of Europe. So, if not cheese, what was it actually made of? It was basically flesh from the head of a pig, typically set in aspic and usually eaten cold at room temperature, or in a sandwich. This dish was popular in the post-war era as it made use of every part of the animal, reflecting a time when nothing went to waste. Many recipes use a bit of lemon juice to add a bit more flavor to the jelly. It has disappeared from our dinner tables and menus, and I don't think this one calls for a comeback. Jars of beef drippings, schmaltz or lard, were not just fats. They were gold. Rendered from the toughest cuts of meat, these jars sat on kitchen counters and in pantries like silent guardians of survival. During rationing years, fat was not just a luxury, it was essential. Schmaltz added flavor to everything, from vegetables to bread. It was a base for soups, stews, and sauces, transforming simple dishes into something hearty and comforting. While many of us today throw out every last bit of fat, back then, not a drop was wasted. People knew that this rendered fat could be used in 100 different ways, and it never went bad. Stored properly, it could last for years without refrigeration. It was the safety net for families when fresh meat was scarce and fresh butter even scarcer. The best part? That rich, golden sheen on top of the jar, the mark of perfect rendering. Thanks to the massive shortages of food that happened during World War II, it became a pretty normal fact of life for people to constantly live off of dehydrated vegetables. I can't begin to overstate how starved people were of basic everyday goods they used to always have the money for and, moreover, were always available in stores. The lack of both of these basic assurances of your day meant that a lot of people's daily script from 8 to 9 a.m. to 10 p.m. was completely flipped on its head. Suddenly, the question of, how am I going to feed my family, became very real. Unfortunately, while questions like that were easy to ask yourself, it was hard to come up with an answer. Dehydrated vegetables were one of the first solutions people ran towards because they were easy to grow and easy to store. But even that had a lot of issues. People who had lived their entire lives in urban centers began sprawling to whatever land they could to grow crops in an attempt to boost their rations. Naturally, they had no knowledge of it, and the country wasn't really doing the best agriculturally with all of its resources focused on the war effort. Lots of crop failure was common. Despite that, some celery, carrots, and onions saved the average American household during the war a lot more than government intervention ever did. During the Great Depression, walnuts and pecans weren't just a tasty snack, they were a prized resource for cash-strapped families. These nuts could be harvested, stored, and used to jazz up otherwise plain meals if you had access to a tree or a generous neighbor. Cracking nuts was labor-intensive, but the payoff was worth it. A rich, fatty ingredient that gave texture and flavor to bread and cookies, stuffing, and casseroles. In the South, pecans were a common sight, falling straight from the trees and into resourceful hands for those lucky enough to live there. The shells of walnuts were tougher, but the reward was similar. Nuts were also very nutritious, with healthy fats, protein, and vitamins that were hard to find in other foods, and they stored well and could even be bartered or sold when money was tight. Depression-era families used them to make nut-based candies, nut milk, and even to top their cornbread pudding. Classic Southern pies needed pecans, and walnuts made their way into cakes and confections. Walnuts and pecans were a luxury that came from nature in a time of indulgences that were rare. Back then, they were a little piece of heaven in tough times, and today, they're a treat. Ever tried hot Dr. Pepper? This warm beverage was made by heating Dr. Pepper and adding lemon slices. It was used in the war days to warm up your insides during the cold winter months. Say goodbye to hot cocoa, because hot Dr. Pepper was all the rage back in the day. It was pretty simple to make. All you had to do was heat the soda to 180 degrees in a stovetop saucepan, then pour it over a thin slice of lemon. It was introduced by the brand to increase sales during colder days when no one wanted a chilly soft drink. Smart marketing, don't you think? So, why did this drink disappear? Well, people just stick to the cold serving of Dr. Pepper now, and I'm not complaining. Homemade vinegar with the mother still growing was more than just a kitchen staple. It was a living legacy passed down in cloudy jars from one generation to the next. At the bottom of those amber bottles, the mother would swirl. A strange, jellyfish-like mass that carried on the fermentation process like a quiet alchemist in the dark. Families used this raw, unfiltered vinegar for everything from preserving vegetables to treating wounds and cleaning floors. It was pungent, powerful, and patient. You did not buy it at the store. You nurtured it in a cool, dark cabinet, sometimes for years. The longer it aged, the stronger it grew. It was alive in a way most food no longer is, breathing through generations, sustaining health, and carrying a tang of old-world wisdom. Some believed the older the vinegar, the better it worked, for digestion, for healing, even for warding off illness. And through it all, the mother remained. During the Second World War, another hobby had been acquired by the mass public, and it was actually crucial at keeping them alive. Lots of people began foraging for dried mushrooms. See, it wasn't a hobby per se for people who were living in rural areas and on the outskirts of society. They had pretty much been very used to already foraging for things and also got ahead of the game when the trend first took over. People foraged for all kinds of reasons, but the chief one among everyone's list was always that it was free. It was the best thing to do and the best thing to look for during the war too, because mushrooms, more than anything else they were so good at doing, they could add an incredible amount of flavor to whatever it was you were making. This meant that people could enjoy meals once in a while too. I know you might have expected a practical reason like how they grew around the environment, the many nutritional benefits of mushrooms, or how long they last. But honestly, people were tired of always thinking about the pros and cons of something. Being logical is an effort, not a trait, you know? Takes energy. Energy was something people desperately lacked because they barely had any sources of joy in their day, and the fact that they could get morels, porcini, even shiitake mushrooms every once in a while definitely cheered them up during their day. It was delicious, right? Nothing unusual about this one. It was a classic hit. Prunes were a popular choice during the Depression because they were cheap, stored well, and were, well, let's just say, effective. Many prominent figures during the 1930s ate frugally, just as most Americans did during the Great Depression. To promote the support of frugal and thrifty eating, Eleanor Roosevelt served prune pudding at formal White House functions. And that's how prunes became all the rage. The fruit was cooked until soft, mashed up, mixed with water and sugar, and a bit of flour or cornstarch to thicken it up. This dessert might not win any beauty contests, but it was a sweet treat that many families enjoyed. Prunes are not the most, luxurious of items out there. I'm sure you pass by prunes in the grocery store without even glancing at them, but they were a lifesaver for our taste buds back in the day. You know what that calls for? A place for them in your cart next time you go grocery shopping. If these old pantry foods stirred up a memory, tell us your favorite in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more tastes of the past.